anyone who's familiar with film history knows that The Birth of a Nation is the first full-length feature film, that D.W. Griffith made this movie 100 years ago, and yet it's considered one of the most racist movies ever made because D.W. Griffith considered The Birth of a Nation the creation of the KKK, and so it's a very provocative title to start with that as The Birth of a Nation, but instead of telling the story of the birth of the KKK, to tell the story of the most successful slave rebellion seemed like a really clever repurposing of that title.
It tells the story of an episode that is too little known, first of all. There's been very little done that indicated the extent to which there were always and continuing rebellions against the institution of slavery by the kidnapped Africans.
But the more he read and the more access he had to the education, the more he started to realize that what was happening to them as enslaved people was wrong. And through a series of visions that he had, he decided that it was time for him to rebel against this institution of slavery. And as he put it, he cut the head from the serpent. And that's when he decided he rounded up, his group of faithful people, and he rebelled. I'm from Virginia, and I was born very close to Southampton County, about an hour and a half away. And they've since changed the name of the town Jerusalem, which actually was called Jerusalem. And my suspicions are because of this event and what happened. I heard about Nat Turner when I was young, but never in the context of actual education and academia. I never had a class where they taught me about Nat Turner and what he'd done. And here I am in Virginia. As a young man, I longed for a hero, of someone that I could look up to in a way that would, represent that figure that stood for his people and sacrificed for his people.
He was someone who, in spite of the fact that he knew that inevitably his actions would lead to his death and the death of those who followed him, was not content to just sit by and, bow his head and sort of go along with the program. Nat Turner believed in the Bible and the Word of God and so on, but at some point had his faith tested, spent some time wrestling with trying to reconcile that reality with the message of love that, he preached, because he was a minister.
It's the first time when you've seen a story that has to do with slavery, and it's the slave that decides to be his own hero and save himself versus waiting for someone else to come in and save the day.
What's happened is that when we have these figures in history, we just know about the person and don't know about the story.
After I read it, I spoke with Nate, and he spoke to me about this being the Black Braveheart, and so I went back and watched that film. I realised the similarities between the oppressed people in Scotland and the oppressed people here in America. It's just that in England and Scotland it was the English oppressing the Scottish, and here it's the southern whites and a system, an establishment that's oppressing African American.
So I think the beauty of a piece like this is for us to investigate even more stories about slave narratives and what has happened in our history, collective history as Americans, black, white, you name it. Yeah, so I think something about it is just so cool.
Nat had been born from what I can tell, on a relatively benevolent plantation where conditions were not nearly as bad on his plantation as they were on some of the surrounding ones. But then in the 1820s, as the drought worsened and the economy in Southern Virginia collapsed, conditions on the plantations kept getting worse and worse, so much so that Nat's own master rented him out to gain extra cash. And in the process of Nat going to these other plantations in order to preach and help keep the other slaves docile, he saw how much worse it was. And other plantations where slaves were being starved to death, tortured to death. I mean, just horrific, brutal conditions.
I saw a new Nat Turner that history has not shown us. So I'm really happy that Nate wrote this script, because it changes the entire way that we look at Nat.
Execute on them this written judgment. Praise the Lord. Sing to him a new song.
When I started taking this film out, I had a lot of, originally I had a lot of pushback. Are they gonna let you make this film? Will you get blackballed after you make this film? Will they hire you anymore? Will you be typecast as this person who is, unearthing things that people don't want to deal with? And I had to kind of face that and say, well, that's exactly what I want.
I got a call from Nate Parker. Nate told me about this project of his, and that he was looking for another producer to be with him on the set. He told me what it was, and I was immediately interested.
We started talking to investors, and people started to respond. They said, this is a story that needs to be told, it's timely, and maybe this will help with our aspirations to finally have some kind of racial peace in this country, if we can confront it and really deal with our past.
Nate Parker is the writer, director, star, lead producer, raised a lot of the financing. I mean, this is clearly a passion project. Nate grew up knowing of him as a local hero, and also knowing that Nat Turner's story was not particularly well known. And Nate's passion is what has kept everybody where they are the entire filming process.
At $8.3 million, it was a tough nut to crack. It's one thing to get people to say yes, another thing to get them to write the check. So I had to figure out a way to get people to make that money real before I lost the people that were already involved. And so one of the things I did as an act of faith is I decided to move to Savannah with my family at a time when we didn't have all the money in the banks. Right before I left, my first AD called and said, I'm not gonna have my director there by himself, I'm on my way. And that's kind of how it happened. Then my line producer came. So our first week of prep, we were just there on faith that the money would come in, and it did. We got our first big chunk of money by, that first Friday. So we were in prep. So we had a 6-week prep, but the first week was 6 people in like an Econo Lodge kitchenette, just believing that the movie would happen.
He looked at films that had the look he wanted, and talked to a number of people before finally deciding on Elliot Davis as the DP.
Who just has a resume a mile long, from the Twilight movies to the Iron Lady. I mean, he's done big budget and small budget films that are just incredibly beautifully shot. Francine Tanchuk as the costume designer, who did Glory, a Civil War movie that also shot in Savannah more than 25 years ago. Nate Parker often refers to this film as the African-American version of Braveheart, and so it's no coincidence that the editor of Braveheart is also editing this movie.
I was able to come across Jeffrey Kirkland, who most would know him from Children of Men. He did The Right Stuff. Like he's been around forever, and had an opportunity to sit with him. I instantly knew not only was he capable, but that he would be the best person for the project, just because of his insight into the period. And he also had a passion. He shared my passion for the material. He responded to the script, so it was an easy hire. And he saved the movie in so many ways. I was told by Mark, chances are we wouldn't be able to build slave cabins, we wouldn't be able to build a barn, we had very little for construction, and he was able to find ways to make the money that he had stretch. And we had all of our cabins built, we had the farm built, and he was just able to make, a little into so much more, and the production value of the film just went through the roof. Armie Hammer's agent and my agent are friendly, so I reached out saying, hey, you think Armie would read this material? He read the material, and before he was even done finishing the script, he called and said, I'll meet Nate and talk about it. I met him, we talked about the project, and by the time of, an hour later, he was saying, I want to be in the project.
He gave me a call and wanted to talk to me about playing this role. and it was pretty cool. So my my agent sent over the screenplay. I read it, loved it. I think it's a story that needs to be told. And after I spoke to Nate over the phone, I could just really see his enthusiasm, his passion, and I could tell that he was like fully prepared to really attack this, this film. And it's a pretty ambitious film.
Nate is very much an instinctual actor, man, director. He runs on his instinct, and he had an instinct that I could be right for Will. And I read the script, we had a few conversations over the phone, and then he was like, yeah, I want you to be the man.
I ain't doing it, all right? No, you get out of here. It ain't gonna happen, baby. I need to get out of here. It ain't gonna happen.
I was also really blessed to have Coleman Domingo. He was actually my very first hire, even before Army. We did Spike Lee's Red Hook Summer together, and I said, I need you in my film. And he says, send me the script. He said, whenever you're ready, I'm ready. He actually turned down a play in London to be able to be available. In Asia, my leading lady, she's probably, if I had to pick the person that I think is the breakout performance, it's her. It wasn't easy what she had to do. When you see the film, you'll see why. The range she had to achieve in such a short period of time made me a bit anxious, because I know as an artist, you need time, and because we're in such a tight schedule, for her to be able to play this woman that went through so much as a result of being an enslaved person. But she showed up, and she did a phenomenal job. I mean, everyone, I can't say enough, Roger Guenveur-Smith, Anjanou Ellis, we just had the best cast. Mark Boone Jr., whom I think transforms in this film, as the Reverend, going from something like Sons of Anarchy. I'm most proud of my cast.
As a rule of thumb, the further back in time you go, the more expensive it is to recreate. On a period film, every single extra has to be pre-fit for wardrobe, have the clothing fit, from the head to toe. If they have any earrings, watches, jewelry, modern haircuts, tattoos, piercings, anything like that is going to have to, be fixed. And then all the props are very expensive and hard to come by because they are so rare. Set dressing, same thing. Even if you find locations that existed in this time period, which is one of the reasons we're in Savannah, is to find 200-year-old plantations.
Right.
Mm-hmm. They'll get a moment where they understand what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Yeah.
The fact that y'all are here means everything to me. Like I said, without y'all, this scene wouldn't have happened. All right, so I appreciate y'all time more than you know.
Right.
All right, let's get a quick amen. Amen.
Amen. It's amazing to me the extent to which the entire crew seems to have bought into Nate's vision. He certainly hasn't functioned as someone who'd never made a feature film before. He's very clear about not just about what his vision is, but about what it takes to achieve that. And of course, filmmaking is a collaborative effort always.
Actors and crew members don't want to work with first-time directors, period, but when you combine that with a director who's going to be acting in almost every single scene, who's also the writer, who's also the producer, it's not a slam dunk.
Anytime there's anything on the set that he thinks doesn't quite fit or match up, he doesn't yell props. He goes over and he starts adjusting things. He's doing it all. And I love that.
As an actor, I'm looking at him wearing all these hats at the same time on set thinking, I could never do that. No way.
He keeps us energized. He keeps things going and people happy, even though, it's difficult at times. There's the heat and the bugs and everything, but, we don't focus on that. It's yeah, let's go, let's do this, yeah.
It's not that we're following Nate necessarily, but we do follow what he believes in, and he's so good at transmitting that to people. And I really think he'll be great at transmitting that in this film to the audience.
The story opens in 1810 when Nat Turner is 10 years old in Virginia, and he's owned by Ben Turner and good friends with John Clark Turner, who's Ben's younger son. At the end of that period, Ben, the father, dies, and Samuel Turner is now the de facto owner, is now inherits him from his father. Having someone like Armie Hammer, who is not only a recognizable name, but an incredibly talented actor and someone that audiences can relate to, really adds an interesting element to the story, because otherwise it's very easy to just take this cartoonish view of, black's good, white's bad, and doesn't do the story any service, because the reality is so much more complicated and so much more interesting. But the truth is, he's a product of the early 19th century and a slave owner who inherits these slaves, who's trying to keep his plantation running and is actually not as good as his father was at it. He's actually doing a terrible job running the farm. And you see in the film, the plantation is getting poorer and poorer.
Nat Turner ultimately decided that, yes, the Word of God was a message of love, but that he could not ignore the plight of his people, and found ways that his faith and the scripture also justified his actions, which amounted to rising up against his oppressors.
There's nothing they can do in retaliation that will make them a bad person after what they've experienced. So when you see those slaves then join forces with Nat's rebellion and kill their masters and kill the people who are perpetuating this and causing this society to exist, I think you have no choice but to root for them, because you just see the depravity of how bad it can get.
Now you're talking. Do I got 225?
He sees me on the auction block and he convinces his master to buy me, and it's not because I'm so pretty he wants his master to buy me so that he can marry me. It's like, I can't live with myself if I know more horrible things are going to happen to this human being. And that's the beginning of us knowing each other.
Anybody that knows nothing knows that if state law says if a nigger is less than 10 paces from the tree line, that nigger need a pass.
There's difficulty walking into a room and trying to be this white, master guy, using the N-word.
Listen, it's really important that you tell me.
There's one scene where I go in and I try to find out where young Nat's dad is. And, just the way he talks to these people, I have a feeling it probably would have been worse in real life, the way he handled the situation. But it's still, you know what I mean? It's kind of trying. It's like I said, kind of jokingly, it's kind of, it's nice to be able to come and help tell the story, but it's kind of a bummer to help put a face on it.
But we've been surrounded by so much darkness in this film for 5 weeks. And we shot my scene with my wife Esther, played by Gabrielle Union. And it was beautiful because, we had drummers, we had dancers, you name it. And we just let the spirit, we let the spirit move us and let the spirit, what was in the ground, move us. And they rolled camera on that. And I thought it was happening organically.
Back then, when you had a family, nothing was really your own. Someone could take your children away. Someone could separate you from your loved one whenever they wanted to at any second, and you had no choice over that. So the love story inside of the story is so beautiful to me, because we are choosing each other, and you get to see us get married and have this baby, and it's the first time in our lives that we actually possess something or feel like we do, even though in the back of our minds we know we can never truly possess anything because we're slaves.
And so when he arrives at the Fowler plantation at the beginning of the rebellion, the one question he asks is, can I do this myself? And walking into that house is such a pivotal moment for Will. It's, I think, hopefully quite a beautiful scene, because although it's very violent, you can't shy away from the violence in this period of time, and you can't also shy away from using that violence as a means to acquire freedom when it's been so brutally kept from you.
We were looking for a stunt coordinator. We knew that we couldn't cheat. We couldn't cut any corners. There were no back doors to be able to get it done. We needed someone that could keep people safe, but could also work very quickly, so we could get this. We had 2 days to shoot. Well, 1 day to shoot our battle sequence, and 1 day to shoot the armory scene. So really 2 days to shoot about 2 weeks worth of material. We were behind the 8 ball every moment of those days.
Well, this is a climactic battle. The rebels have fought their way plantation by plantation. Their goal was to get here to Jerusalem, where the armory is.
Gus Williams, who was our stunt coordinator, he showed up, you know, and he did above and beyond what we asked them to do. You know, I call him and say, these are the things, these are the special moves that I want, or the special sequences I want for every character. Can you do it? Of course I can. He had his people ready, brought in people. We had people that were having to play more than one role, and everyone just showed up. He brought a team that was so experienced, that was so excited to be there, and they showed up and they got it done.
Officers who racial profile and put slugs in us makes me think they want us to stink on the brink of insanity. We screaming for justice, they send tanks, demanding we protect the family anarchy. Who Klux planning him, demanding he damaged me so. My fantasy is every single one of us come against the evil divide of people. It's common sense. The fury, I hope the whole world hear me, no justice. So I became a revolutionary. No matter if you're red, white.
I feel just a little bit tired for the first time.
My first thought was, if he shoots this as beautifully as he's written it, it's going to be a major success. It's a beautifully written script.
It shows the roots of the movement. It shows the roots of the rebellion, and it shows that these are a people. These are their own nation, which is why I think it's a beautiful thing that he's called it Birth of a Nation, because he's taking the name back. Like this is the new birth of the nation, and I think that's powerful.
You know, even today, you know, there are enslaved people all over the world. You know, there's sex trafficking that happens. So there are people who are living this. When you have the luxury of not living it, but you understand it, it is very hard to experience it on camera and not bring in your own sort of, you know, sense of what is right and what is wrong. People who were experiencing this during that time didn't have that privilege.
He was someone that I could look up to. He was someone that sacrificed everything for the progress of his people, and that's, you know, what I want to do. You know, no one can write this stuff. Like it's history. You know, this film will be more accurate than most films that we've seen like it. These historical action dramas.
I think it's going to be a great film. So that's always rewarding, and it's the kind of opportunity to be involved in something like this that doesn't often come along. And I've learned over the course of my career not to take that for granted.
You know, from what people have been taught about Nat Turner, he was, you know, some fanatical barbarian that just that lied about visions, and you know, no one had history because no one knew what to. No one was inspired to seek the truth. So you fast forward now to times where, you know, cell phones have captured the true vision and devaluing of people of African descent in this country, and people starting to ask for answers. You know, how is it possible that we're still here? We've gone through a civil rights movement, yet people are still being killed unarmed with their hands up all over the country, and at a disproportionate rate.
The more people know about the true history, the better, and the more understanding it fosters between us all as Americans and as human beings.
For guys like me and for the target audience are going to kind of have fun rooting on Nat, you know. I mean, it's such a despicable time, and it's neat to see some guys rise up and not take some shit anymore.
I hope a project like this will just say, yeah, wow, we did go through a lot. And it's not that we're victims, it's that it's to recognize we went through this and we still made it, and we're still going, and we can keep going.
If I never make another film, but I'm able to make this film, that takes away this idea of sanitizing history and really pulls back the rug on who we actually are and what we were, and why we are now, then I win. I've been victorious in what I believe to be my purpose as a filmmaker.
high praise of God be on the mouths of the saints, and a two-edged sword in their hands to execute vengeance on the demonic nations. Sing to him a new song.
And we'll rise up. I like the waves. We'll rise up. In spite of the ache, we'll rise up. And we'll do it 1,000 times again.
You're waiting on something.
See, it's a couple ways that we can go about this. We can carry on, or we can flip a new switch. We can't just put a damper on the fire and never take the chance to let it rise up. Maybe 'cause we know we won't survive us, afraid to let it burn. We got one foot on I love you, the other one's on it's over. It's easier just to lay down.